forget for a second, like forget trying to quantify what negligible means, but let's talk about acceptable. That's actually terminology that comes from the IPCC report, and there's definitions around that. Right? What is an acceptable risk of uncertainty around reversals, right? And like if we start talking about acceptable, I think that opens a lot of doors for us because it actually allows us to say that most solutions have risk. If there is risk, we need to take that into account, and then we need to manage the risk.
Hey everyone, how are you? I am your host, Deb Ryan, and I'm joined today by my other co-host, Teresa Hartman. And
Hi,
welcome
Deb.
to our How are you? And welcome to our next episode of Common Ground. Before we kick off, as usual, make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast so that you can see all our upcoming episodes. Teresa, it's great to see you. We've both had a bit of a busy week. What's going on?
Oh, it's been a crazy week. Yeah, crazy week. We had a tram crash in Lisbon with
I did see
quite a
that.
few. Yeah, no, it's been scary. It's been
Yeah.
scary. Mhm.
It's never good. I heard that was in a quite a like popular kind of tourist area. I haven't been to Lisbon, but heard it was in quite a popular tourist area and stuff, which would have been very disrupting and a bit confronting.
Yeah, very confronting. Yeah, and I think it just like opens up questions for like tourism in Portugal, right? And do
Mm.
people feel safe? And like,
Yeah,
you know,
that's
is
true.
this a destination for people?
Yeah, it is a very popular. I feel like most of my friends that have been to Europe this year have all been to Portugal. So yeah, it's definitely been a high visited area.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. It ended up on like the American travel blog or something. Like it feels
All the
like I
Americans
always
are in
say I feel like
Portugal.
I'm in California. You though.
Like, what's the point?
He's a tech. And I'm just like, where are the Portuguese people?
Oh dear. Well, glad that you weren't involved and you're okay and stuff like that. But yeah, something to for everyone to keep an eye on and things. So today we thought we'd take a little bit of a different turn this week. We've spent the last few weeks talking about climate policy and particularly US climate policy and EU climate policy and trade and some of that kind of stuff and the impact on climate. But this week we were going to turn our attention to Paris Agreement and Article 6. And there's a lot going on. There's an expert, what's it called? The expert panel or whatever it's called next week that they're
There
meeting.
was an open consultation on permanence under the PACM, so the Paris Agreement trading mechanism. So that was open over the summer. And then this week there was a methodology expert panel meeting where they reviewed the comments that came in. It sounds like it might have been quite overwhelming. I was just reading that they've had something like 1,000 comments come in on the proposed guidance on permanence for the sort of the methodology that will allow like what goes into the crediting mechanism, right? And like there's obviously emotions are running high and people are quite have there's a lot of opinions out there.
So we thought we would dive in a little bit around things like permanence and stuff and unpack some of our own opinions around it just to add to the mix. With because for those that aren't super familiar, and I know that's probably a mix of people listening and stuff. Article 6, and we're talking about a couple of different pieces of Article 6 was part of the 2015 Paris Accord. So we've been talking about Article 6 for a long time. There was a lot of traction made against Article 6.2 and 6.4 at the COP. I always get the COP numbers mixed up. What COP 26 in 2021 in Glasgow? Is that the right one? Where there was a lot of sort of a little bit of resolution, and then last year at COP in Baku, which I believe was COP 29 in 2024. Like, yeah, be nice if these just overlapped, right? And like, but they don't. Um, there was a lot more resolution, and we, again, around Articles 6.2 and 6.4. I don't know, do you have any kind of thoughts about like the history of this and what you've kind of seen and some of that kind of stuff as it relates to
Yeah.
Articles?
I mean, so it finally got right, like we're finally at a point of operationalization, which I think is super exciting for anybody who's been working in the carbon space, right? As in like we've had the Paris Agreement bouncing around for a good decade now. And to finally be at a point where we're operationalizing the carbon trading carbon trading mechanism under the agreement is huge. right? So
Yeah.
like huge step forward. There's a whole lot of work going on at the methodological level, right? So like some credits are being grandfathered in from the previous scheme. Other methodologies are being developed specifically for this crediting mechanism. But yeah, so we're all kind of like holding our breath and waiting for this to actually start trading. So generally speaking, huge step forward,
Yeah.
right? And like I think when you get into the nitty-gritty of like what is in this guidance, then there were some quite stringent requirements in there that are probably going to be prohibitive to nature-based solutions being in there in general, but also prohibitive to getting significant volume in the market, right? And I think like to your question earlier, is it still worth investing in a market if
Yeah.
there isn't volume to trade?
Right? Yeah, because if there's not, so let's take a step back, because one of the things you and I were talking about earlier, and I think it's a good place to start, is, you know, again, we've been kicking around this thing for 10 years. Like, what was in, like, as you think about it, like, what was the point of the Paris Agreement in the first place? Like, how should we even frame that and think about it from a starting point?
Yeah. I mean, I think the goal of the Paris Agreement is super clear, right? Is in like we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or below, ideally.
Mhm.
So I think overall, like the idea of the Paris Agreement is limiting global warming. If you want to limit global warming, you need to have emissions by 2030, and then peak them in 2050. Super easy in theory on paper. To do that, we need a bunch of things, right? We need an energy transition, industrial transition, a transport transition. We've talked about all of these things. So different energy sources, different electricity sources, different fuel sources, and so on. But we also need a land use transition, right? So like we need to change the way that we use natural carbon sinks. So when we're logging, when we are producing agricultural goods, and so on and so forth. So we need to actually change that. I think the problem that we've seen on multiple really in like every emissions trading scheme around the world, right? Like the question has always been like, should land use emissions be included? And then the other way around, should emission reductions or removals from natural sources be allowed into an emission trading system, right? Because they may not be as permanent or you know, the yeah, they may not be as permanent, right? So like the big question is always like if you're creating an offset, if something will be used as an offset, right, to offset somebody else's emission, it should be additional, right? As in, like, it should not have occurred under any other circumstances. And it should be permanent, as in, like, you can't say I offset my emission here with this reduction over there if then that reduction gets reversed later on, right? So, like, example, you're planting a forest and that forest burns down, right? So then you're releasing those CO2 emissions back into the atmosphere. Obviously, that wouldn't count for an offset. That said, technology solutions, and you and I have been talking about this for a while, like technology solutions aren't always permanent either. And
Yeah.
I think we don't really talk about that.
So, I mean, thinking about this, like a lot of the debate that's going on right now around how do we define permanence, in particular, do you think it's because we're trying to create the perfect offset, which potentially doesn't exist? Do you think that's where some of this comes from?
Yeah. So it definitely comes from this idea of like, like one state, well, in the case of the Paris Agreement, one state has higher emissions, the other one has lower emissions. Can we net that out? In the voluntary carbon market, it's the same idea. It's just like one company hasn't abated yet, the other one has abated. Like, can we net those out? So yeah, like the idea definitely comes from like, if we want to net out emissions in a global accounting system, then of course the offset credit needs to be perfectly additional and perfectly permanent. I think your question is a good one, right? Like, does that exist? Do we
Yeah,
have
like yeah,
Yeah,
like nothing seems like if we chase perfection, aren't we just going to stall out? Like, isn't we're just going to end up there's not going to be enough credits that meet the criteria. There won't be a big enough market, and we won't make any progress. Like, uh,
yeah, so is perfection the enemy of the good? So like there are credits that are perfectly permanent, like you talked about it earlier, right? Like so the destruction of ozone depleting substances, like once you destruct, like chemically separate that gas, that doesn't come back together, right? So like there are solutions that are perfectly permanent, as in like if you can't destroy a gas, like it doesn't come back together. That said, like you and I have talked about this, right? Like there was a new study out, which I think you also read, which was around CO2 leaking from storage, right? So like a lot of the time when we think about engineered solutions, we think about like direct air capture or BECCS, where we capture carbon, we capture CO2, and then we store it underground. Um, and it feels permanent, right? Because you've pumped it underground.
Yeah.
Except it's not always permanent either, right?
Yeah.
Like there can be leaks that can leak back into the atmosphere.
Yeah. Yeah, the study came out, and let me pull this up quickly so that we get it right, but it was published this week in, it was researchers at Imperial College London, and they published it in, the Nature journal, earlier this week. So if people are looking for that, you can go find it, and it was around this idea that, yeah, we've been talking about carbon capture and storage, so using underground depleted reservoirs or water reservoirs and stuff to pump CO2 underground to remove it. And that isn't they've estimated that the actual potential of how much could be stored is way less than we thought it was, because if there's volcanic and seismic activity, there's risk of leak. If things are too shallow, if the capstone and all this kind of stuff that's the subsurface um, doesn't seal. There's ways that this gas can make its way back to surface, and there is. I actually did a podcast last year with one of my former associates, Zach Evans. If people are curious, he's a underground gas storage specialist, not just on CO2 but natural gas and stuff like that. And we talk about it. Like there is cases, particularly here in the US, where there is a lot of underground natural gas storage of leaking. Um,
Mhm.
there's one particular case that was quite prominent in California a number of years ago called Aliso Canyon, and it was problematic. So, um, yeah, it's not this silver bullet that everyone thinks it's like. I don't know. I feel like we've gotten lazy because we're like, well, we can remove CO2, and so we'll just take it all out and we'll put it underground, and look, it'll be fine. So we don't have to do anything different because we're going to have this technology and it's going to solve all our problems. Um, I don't know. It feels a little bit lazy to me. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Like,
I love that. I love the bluntness of this. This is really lazy. I mean, like, we do need removals, right? Like every scenario shows us that we're going to need removals. Like we definitely do need removals, but they're not the silver bullet either, right? Like we
yeah,
can't just say we're all going to keep emitting and then remove all the emissions in the end, as in like we're not going to invest. We do need to invest in avoidance. We do need to invest in reductions. And one of the ways to do that is nature-based solutions, right? And
yeah,
like I think that there's a curve that we don't talk about very much. It is that idea that like it matters when an emission is emitted in time, right?
mm,
As in like within the next like 10 to 15 years, there are some really critical tipping points that we're going to reach if we keep blasting CO2 into the atmosphere. So actually what matters the most from a climate perspective right now is to reduce emissions that we continue to be blowing into the atmosphere, right? So like we need to stop the sources, right? And like I think that that's something that we really need to talk about more, as in like what's that curve of creating tipping points and like which solution needs to kick in when.
mm,
And there was a really interesting article that many of you may have seen. It was an op-ed on Carbon Pulse where like Gabrielle Labette at UNET was arguing that, you know, there's also a curve of like how long CO2 resides in the atmosphere, right? So like the first chunk of emissions, so something like 40% of CO2 emissions, like the perturbations, so like the effects of that are actually removed within 20 years. So that's a relatively short time span in the space of how we think about monitoring in carbon markets, right?
mm,
And then the next, something like 20% take 80 years to be removed, right? Isn't like, it's not like we can actually say you have to monitor for CO2 or you have to monitor your projects for like, is it 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 100 years, or is it 1,000 years? Like, it's just not that clear how long CO2 actually resides in the atmosphere, right? So like,
mm,
I think that there's both, right? Like there's this curve of like, it really matters when the CO2 comes out, as in like right now is really critical. And then there's that curve of like permanence is not binary either, right? As in like it's not like there are solutions that are permanent and solutions that are not permanent. It's that all solutions, most solutions do bear a permanence risk, right? So like the question that I'm much more interested in is like, well, how else can we address that, right? Like what do we
mm.
do about insurance? What do we do about pooled buffer pools, right? Like what are the other mechanisms that we can take at like a portfolio level where we actually look at, so like within a mix of technology and nature-based solutions, like how do we ensure the nature-based risk that does occur?
Yeah. And I think And we can link the article for folks that are interested. It's a really, really great opinion piece that was put out. And I think this idea of binary, particularly as the Article 6 kind of is debating permanence of like, how do you then, again, decide which credits are going to meet the criteria of permanence and are going to be credible enough to be used in the PACM? It is, that's the right acronym, isn't it? There's so many acronyms in space. I get
Yeah.
them all so back to front and confused. But like, I think that's a really interesting point around this. It's like, because nothing is black and white. We are still learning. And if we start to exclude certain types of credits because they don't meet some arbitrary binary sort of rule around permanence, we're going to limit the size of the market and not make any progress. I don't know. That's what it feels like. So I thought the binary piece versus thinking about something in terms of this more like decay of CO2, like you're talking about, because of when it actually does leave the atmosphere and stuff like that. So it's, I don't know. It's it's going to be a challenge, I think, because there is a lot of people who are pretty firm around like we need the perfect credit, only the perfect credits should make it and exist, and it's like to what end? Like I don't know. So
Yeah, I mean, I do think we need the perfect credit. Like, we need a mix of solutions and we need them at different points in time, right? So, like, it's not like I think that that's a point that's really well argued by Ruben Gabriel in that piece is like, it's not about what is the one perfect solution. It's about like, what's the portfolio of solutions that we need to enable, right? And like,
yeah,
I think that that's a little bit like to your earlier point of like, what is the goal of the Paris Agreement? The goal of the Paris Agreement is limiting global warming, right? And I think the question is a little bit what is the goal of Article 6 within that? So, like the carbon crediting mechanism within that, like, is the goal to create the perfect offsetting mechanism for countries, or is the goal to actually enable a transition? Because
mm,
enabling a transition is very, very different, right? That
yeah,
means you need to de risk early stage solutions, you need to funnel finance into solutions that need scaling. And then over time, those solutions become less and less additional, right? As in, like, over time, we would say that renewable energy nowadays in many places isn't very additional anymore because it's become so cost competitive, right? But like it got that way in part through carbon taxes and in part through subsidies. So I think that to me, like, really is the question, right? Like, isn't Article 6 there to enable a transition? And doesn't that mean that it also needs to incentivize shorter term solutions that maybe do not have 1,000 years of permanence, right? And that maybe cannot reach that negligible risk threshold, which we should talk about, right? But like, isn't the point of the entire agreement to enable a transition to funnel finance into the places where it's most needed, to ensure that we can reduce emissions at scale, right? And at scale in scale like volume, but also at scale in a temporal scale,
mm,
right? Like at the points in time when we need it most, and now is when we need it most.
yeah. And I think your point, and I think this often gets lost in conversations around credit attributes. At least I think it does, where it's like, is something permanent and is an additional? This idea of changing additionality over time, which we're all quite aware of, like your solar panel example is a great one, right? Like this idea of like building in the changing additionality with time, assuming that there's enough finance and you can get costs below a certain level and things like that. Like that also feels very enabling. And I don't feel like we're talking about changing of additionality scales with time as part of climate modeling or carbon credit modeling or anything. It's just, is it additional or not? Like, again,
Yeah.
very binary.
It's
Like,
another binary. It's another,
yeah.
I mean, like, and pros and cons, right? So, like, if you take the ratings agency perspective, you say you're going to rate a credit on the contractually determined crediting period, right? So, like, if this project is running for 20 years, we're going to look at the 20 years and we're going to assess whether it's additional over 20 years and whether it's permanent over 20 years. Um, and you get some really interesting curves, right? So, like, projects are the most additional at their inception because that's when you prove additionality, right? And that's when you do your baseline. That's when you actually look at your regulatory environment, right? So, like, at the outset of a project, it is the most additional and nobody else is doing it. There's no government program, there's no competition, there's no other market solution. Over the lifespan of a project, you would expect, if you're doing your job well, you would expect the additionality to decrease, right? As in, like, as this activity, whatever you're doing. So, like whether you're putting cook stoves out there or whether you are protecting forests, like if you have good community engagement around that and good political engagement around that, you would expect your practice to become more and more common practice.
Mm,
And once it is common practice, it's no longer additional, right? So, like the best carbon project makes itself redundant. Like
mm,
that's the whole point of it, right? So, like additionality over time, you would expect to go down.
yeah,
Permanence over time is this really interesting counterintuitive problem that, like, if you're only looking at a 20-year time span, the permanence risk is much higher at the beginning of the project, right? As in, like, you have 20 years in which something can go wrong. So it could be a
mm,
policy change, or it could be a natural disaster, or it could be whatever it is, right? So, like, your grid could go back to fossil fuels, or your forest could burn down. But you have 20 years in which, like, something can happen. So
yeah,
your permanence risk is actually higher in the beginning than it is towards the end of your crediting period, right? So, like, if you're only looking at permanence for like the contractual period of time that the project developer has confirmed that they will monitor this, then they have a lower permanence risk towards the end of the monitoring period, right? And like, I
yeah.
think that that's a little bit the logic that you, sorry, this is getting very
No,
complex.
it's great.
But this is a little bit the logic behind the other camp who say, well, we shouldn't be assessing permanence on the crediting period, which is 20 years or 40 years or whatever it is. We should be assessing permanence on a neutral time frame, right? And most of the time people put 100 years forward, right? As in, like, will this be credibly permanent over the next 100 years, right? Because, like, if you only have 20 years, and we often talk about APD in this context, right? So, like, if you look at avoided planned deforestation projects, and the developer comes in and stops the deforestation that was already zoned into the development plan by the government, but you're only there, your concession only lasts so long, right? So you get a
Yeah,
concession for 10 years or a concession for 40 years, but your concession lasts so long. You can basically expect that there's a reasonable expectation that after your crediting period, this area will get deforested because there was a pre-existing plan to deforest it,
yeah.
right? And
And
like, I
it's
think
only
that
the time of the lease, essentially, that they can protect
time of
it.
the lease is really, really important here, right? And like you could probably say the same thing for geological storage, right? Like if the developer is only like on that storage area for so long to monitor that it's not leaking, then like, who's going to guarantee it's not leaking afterwards?
Yeah.
But
Well,
I think
and
that it's a little bit
companies change, and I mean, the life cycle of a company in terms of who's even responsible and stuff like that, 20 years is a long time for some companies to even still exist, right? Like, then it's like,
a
uh,
100 years is longer than many countries have existed on this planet,
yeah.
right? So
So,
like the idea that we're going to monitor something for a hundred
yeah.
years is actually incredibly ambitious.
And it brings up the question of then whose responsibility is it? Is it the government's responsibility? Is it going to be the UN's responsibility? This is partly why we have a huge orphan well problem in the US, because oil and gas companies that had those wells went bankrupt and don't exist anymore. So they're orphans because they don't have parents. It's where that language comes from. Like, that's why we call them orphan wells. So, like, but it's no different with an underground storage project, with a forest, with a cook stove in someone's house. Like, think about how often you replace stuff in your own house. Like, I'm not going to keep a cook stove for 100 years. Like,
That would be I would really welcome that if we didn't have any planned obsolescence in
like,
our household
right?
goods.
We
But,
don't
like,
have
that's
time
the
for that.
thing,
My
right?
my
Like,
last stove only lasted like I think it was 10. It, like, nearly blew up my house. It was a bad day. Like,
don't do that. Don't do that. No, but I mean, like, your point is really valid, right? It's around, like, institutional longevity, right? And, like,
yeah,
you can put the responsibility to monitor on the project developer, but who says the project developer isn't gonna go broke? Or
yeah,
you can put it, a lot of the time, the standards have actually taken on that responsibility, and the standards have said that they will assure 100-year monitoring with the idea that, like they actually run a buffer pool out of which you can then compensate. And with the idea that hopefully the standard will persist longer than the individual developer.
yeah.
Also not a given, right? Like we are seeing
No,
standard planning at huge economic loss. And then like now we're looking at the UN, right? And we're saying like, well, will the UN assure that there will be continued monitoring after this developer goes bust, right? Or like the way that it's framed at the moment, it's much more like all those credits will be cancelled
yeah.
after it goes bust, right? Because
And
you can no longer assure monitoring.
yeah, like, and this goes back, never mind, like, depending on where those rules kind of end up falling, depending on what makes it even into the like list of credits that are acceptable under the crediting mechanism. you then, and I know you were talking about negligible risk before, but it goes back to even like companies' risk profile buying credits to do their own offsetting, because this idea of risk, and if they can't guarantee that those credits are going to still be valid, and then they get in trouble for greenwashing and all this kind of stuff, then who's going to buy the credits? Like, if we can't figure some of this out and make, we just get into this chicken and egg issue of like, okay, like the risk profile of some of this, if it's not clear, is challenging for companies. But if we make it too prescriptive, then there won't be enough credits that actually even make the grade, and it won't make a big enough market. So I don't know, like
Yeah, and
so
like I
many
mean the other
different.
way around, right? So like okay, so maybe there's in the market. Some people would welcome that, but I would say the other way, like what you said earlier to me is so critical. Is like we can either have imperfect action right now, and that means that we're trying to do something about a global problem that's threatening all of our lives, right? Like that's what it is, right? Like fires, extreme weather, sea level rise, like it's threatening like our habitat, right? Like it's threatening cities that people live in. So either we have an incentive structure to make countries, companies, and individuals act, or we have an incentive structure that prevents action, right?
Mm,
And like I think like that scares me so much more that we're creating policies and guidelines and rules and regulations that make it harder for us to take any action, right?
right.
Because there's no financing mechanism anymore to finance that action. And I'm just like, we need to protect carbon sinks. We need to invest in technologies as well. We need to invest in removal. We need to do all of those things. But then, like, let's create financing mechanisms around that and not create more hurdles, more barriers to investment around that,
Yeah.
right? Because, like, more and more people are actually walking away from this simply because it's too complex, right? So, like, not even because the bar is too high, but actually because my sense is that, many of the companies that I talk to just feel like it's too confusing, right? Like voluntary compliance, the rules, the claims, the supply side integrity, the market integrity, like it's just very confusing.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So I wanted to come back to it because you were talking about it, but this idea of the negligible risk piece. So, like, where do you think, where do you think that's going to play a role? How do you think that's going to factor into some of these conversations around permanence and stuff like that? Like, I don't know.
Yeah. So I think like in this case, right, the UN, well, the expert panel, the methodological expert panel were consulting on, you could cease your monitoring activities once you prove that there's negligible risk of reversal, right? So, like, if you can show that, like, you're not going to reverse this emission reduction or removal, you don't have to keep monitoring it, so you don't have to spend that money. Um, I think the consultation was around, like, what is the threshold for negligible, right? So, some people said it was 0.1% of a chance of a reversal. Some people said it was 5. The vast majority of respondents actually refused to pick a number because they're just like, well, give me scenario modeling of like, what's out there. What is the chance of like what is the chance of reversal for everything that's out there? And then tell me what the climate impact would be if it was reversed, right? As in
Yeah.
like give me like don't just ask me to pick a number out of the sky. But that's the idea of like negligible reversal, right? As in like we don't think so like what we said before, like a gas that has been destroyed cannot come back.
Right.
A gas that has been pumped underground, like reasonably, you could demonstrate that in this area there is no risk of a leak, right? You could probably never demonstrate that there is no risk of reversal for a natural carbon sink because there always could be like physical
Yeah.
factors reverse. But then that just means you need to monitor, right? And like to like in all fairness, like monitoring is getting cheaper. We're doing more remote sensing. Like for many solutions, that really is the cost of monitoring is going to come down, right, over time, and we'll get better at like biomass estimates and so on. Um, but yeah, and then there's this other proposal, and I think it was in the UNEP consultation response where they basically said like forget for a second, like forget trying to quantify what negligible means, but let's talk about acceptable, right? And like that's actually terminology that comes from the IPCC report, and there's definitions around that, right? As in like what is an acceptable risk of uncertainty around reversals, right? And like if we start talking about acceptable, I think that opens a lot of doors for us because it actually allows us to say that most solutions have risk
Yep.
If there is risk, we need to take that into account, and then we need to manage the risk, right? And like there can be risk management practices, there can be insurances around that, there can be buffer pools around that, and then your insurance premium just goes up and down depending on like how good your risk mitigation is, right? And like I think that
Yep.
that really to me is like a really smart way around a question that I believe to be unanswerable, right?
Yeah.
As in like what is negligible.
Well, and companies, I mean, I've done risk management work before and things like that. Like companies, particularly a lot of industrials who we want to be the ones buying these credits, right, are really familiar with the idea of acceptable risk. And that also then for the individual companies, they have their own risk profiles of what that acceptable risk looks like for them. And again, like you said, then they can plan around it. And there are, you can create risk matrices and all this kind of stuff that people have been doing for a long time to prevent disaster, essentially, right? Like this, reversal and what that climate impact is, for some people and for some companies, that disaster is like an oil rig blows up or a refinery blows up, which we've had those kind of instances in the past. So the idea of acceptable risk to me also seems like it would be the logical solution as well, because it also is an on ramp for companies with their own risk profiles. So, because I don't know, as you're talking about the negligible risk piece, it just feels like, aren't we going back into this sort of thing of like all statistics are made up? Like, so like it could be, like it's like to try and even put a number on it, we'll end up fighting about what that number is instead of, to your point, like actually just doing stuff. Like it just, I don't know, it seems crazy. So I don't know, just for a number that's we know is going to be wrong. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, like, we should be doing stuff right. We should be prioritizing action over inaction, and then I think like it's fair to say that you need to put safeguards around that, right? So like, let's
yeah,
prioritize action with acceptable risk frameworks, right? Like, let's prioritize actions that we can actually safeguard around, right? Like, can we demonstrate that there's monitoring in place? Can we demonstrate that there's risk management in place? Can we demonstrate that there's a reasonable expectation of the entity, the company, the institution to to continue existing.
yeah,
I mean, let me see what we're talking about, right? Like, is
yeah,
this developer just going to disappear and then like this area is no longer monitored?
yeah,
So yeah, completely with you. I think it's all about acceptable risk. We are waiting to see what the experts
yeah,
come with. They've been sitting all week reviewing consultation comments. I think we'll see outcomes of that meeting next week.
yeah. So yeah,
So we'll
we're
planning.
recording. It's the 5th of September today. So like, yeah, hopefully, maybe next week, or I don't know. It'll be interesting. I think you said this at the top. It'll be interesting to see if they actually do make a decision or if they just take a little bit more time, given just how many comments and stuff they got as part of it. So I don't
Yeah,
know. More to come.
holding our breath.
This has been great, Teresa, as always. Super fun conversation. Again, like you said at the top, like even though we've started to get some resolution and we're starting to operationalize Article 6, there's still a lot, particularly Article 6.4, there's still a lot that we're trying to figure out. So this has been great.
So much more to come. Good to
Yeah.
chat. Take
Thanks,
care.
Teresa.